After d4, d5, c4, knight c6, knight c3. So we play in the Chigorin, and we're looking at the variation with the 4 knights. So as we know, we play bishop g4, and now after e3, e5. So we've seen this extensively in the past. Let's look at a couple of lines that we haven't seen from both the variation where they take in e5 and the variation where they take in d5 with the pawns. So when the pawn takes in e, as we know, we have to take this back. Obviously the knight in f3 is pinned, and now two options. One of them is the pawn taking here. Now we've seen this already, but after c6 and bishop e2, bishop takes knight, as we remember, but something we haven't seen, the novelty, is bishop takes back. Now this is not particularly good at all. Usually they want to take with the pawn to preserve the bishop, but in this case, since they're giving you the chance, they will then just keep swapping. However, there's a problem with this, slight problem, is that after taking the pawn, then white can decide to swap everything. This is, you're supposed to take back with the queen in order to keep the pawn structure safe. However, white can choose to take you, and now you've got an isolated pawn. Let's just see how to keep that pawn safe. So let's see how to defend that pawn. King e2, there's no need to castle, the queens are not on the board, so you got to play king d7. Rook d1, you play king e6. And that's how the pawn is safe. And now this is slightly better for black. However, white is playing the variation where he swaps everything. So, of course, it's going to be a very boring situation. b3 to develop the bishop. There's no way to develop from this diagonal, because you can take the pawn and then defend it. b3, bishop d6. And after bishop to d2, save everything with f6. You don't have to worry anymore. g3 to stop us from putting pressure on h2. a5. Rook a to c1, h5. That's how you play this. And after h4, obviously because we want to play h4, so white is playing the best move, h4 to stop that. Rook h to c8. Black is just doing better here. Even though we have an isolated pawn, we want to play rook c6 and then pile up the rooks. And whenever we get taken, we can reunite the pawns. However, if white plays this like a machine, it should be a draw. So yeah, that's why I've kept this line for the very end of this saga, because it's basically the one where we cannot make any single plan in a way that our opponent is just swapping everything. Unfortunately, that's a possibility. Let's go back here. After taking the pawn in e5, we went through pawn takes in d5. We've seen much more of that in previous videos. What about bishop e2 straight away? Now here you take the knight once again. And when the bishop takes back, in this case, since the white player didn't take the pawn in d5, we can take the pawn in c4. And that's a free pawn. Now let's talk about this. There's two options we're going to look at. One of them is what you're looking at right now. Probably bishop takes b7 seems good. Wins a pawn. But now you take the queen. Take back. Rook b8 attacks the bishop. Bishop cannot check us. Has to go to a6. Puts pressure on the pawn. Rook to b6. Attacks the bishop once again. Bishop has to go to c8. g6. And after castle, bishop to b4. What's the point of bishop b4? Why did we play this move? After a3, for example, you play bishop a5. Obviously, you're not going to get forked like this because you can take en passant. So bishop to a5. We want to stay in this diagonal to stop the bishop from developing and the rook from going to e1. This is a very crucial move in the Chigorin. So after knight to c3, seems to be making sense. King e7, attacking the bishop. So the bishop will have to go. Bishop h3. We take this knight. Pawn takes back. And we have this double isolated pawn. Our opponent has an isolated pawn. It doesn't look like we're better, but we're going to play knight d3. And the bishop can't really develop to d2 because then we will go to b2. And you see, the bishop can't go to b2 either. The rook cannot go to b1. So it's kind of a really bad situation for our opponent. We can play knight e4 and attack this weak pawn, and we are better off. Bishop to d2, for example, you play rook to b2. What about rook f to d1? Then you just play knight e4. You're attacking the bishop. When the bishop moves, you can take it. Let's say the bishop moves to still keep an eye on f2. You know, you can also put the rook in d8 just to stop the arrival of the rook in d7. You can also play f5, but you're gonna have this attack on this weak pawn. You can also play rook c2. You cannot be attacked by anyone, and then the knight will be landing here. It's, you know, you can win the game easily. If instead of rook f2 d1, straight after attacking the bishop here with the rook, what if the bishop just retreats? Rook h to b8 comes now, and after g3 to play in fianchetto, you just play rook c2 and you're winning that pawn. If instead of g3 there, let's say f4, our opponent might want to try and challenge, maybe bishop f2, or simply f5 would be a good idea. Here you just play knight to d5 and you're targeting these two weak pawns. So in this position, straight after taking the pawn in c4, we saw bishop takes in b7. What about this move? Queen check. Okay, c6 to block it. And after castle, because there's nothing else to do, you can't really, see that move is actually wrong. You play b5. Now you have to know the patterns. That's how you punish this. Queen to c2. Queen to d3. Asking for a swap. That swap kind of has to happen because we also threaten knight takes f3, and it's a horrible situation. The queen takes, you're going to take back here, produce a pass pawn, rook to d1, attacks the pawn, castle, and you're defending it very well. b3, only way to develop the bishop that seems to be making sense. King to b7. Now remember, knight to b5 is not a free pawn because you can take the bishop in f3 with a check and then recapture the knight. a4 seems to be making perfect sense by white, trying to open everything up on the king. Okay, a6, that's it. Take, that's fine. Bishop to b2, developing the bishop. This doesn't look like a bad game at all for white, except for the pass pawn. Bishop to e7, rook to d2, piling up the attack on that pawn, but then you play rook to d7. Rook a to d1, bishop to b4. You just pin that knight, and this rook can't take you at all. It's a completely winning position. We're gonna close the line here. So let's take it from the start. And today we can finally close the Chigorin saga forever. Now you know how to always beat the Queen's Gambit. So e3, e5. And let's look at the variation where they take the pawn in d5. Now here we take back, and we have seen this in the past. Now, there's a line here that reconnects to the very first episode of the Chigorin saga, which is h3 straight away. As we know, we take the bishop, queen takes back, and now knight d to b4. We're attacking c2. Now, in the first video, I think this was the very first variation I ever examined. I think we went through like lots of things, d5 or queen to d1. To stop knight c2. There's a move we never explored, which is queen to e4. Remains active, puts more attack on this pawn, and also guards c2. What to do? Okay, f5. Kick the queen away. Now you might say, okay, what if the queen just takes the pawn? Fine. Now you can take this one. Take the central pawn. And obviously, if pawn takes, then knight takes in d4 is a much better situation, because obviously now you have two pieces attacking this square. The queen will have to move. And it's now impossible to stop us from winning the exchange, winning the rook. If queen goes to e4 and check, you know, you play queen e7, you're forcing a swap. But it looks like now white can stop that with a little sacrifice. It's a queen takes, bishop takes back, and now king to d1, sacrificing a tempo, sacrificing the position of the king. However, white still has the bishop pair. Where is this going? Well, this still does, it just loses completely because of long castle, right? So there was no way to stop that. So back in this position, instead of taking the pawn in d, what if white counterattacks and tells this knight to go away? Fine, we take this one. They take us, and now you take this bishop with the threat of horrible discover checks. So queen e4 check, queen e7. And after queen swaps, these are all white playing only best moves, computer moves to escape this horrible situation. King takes e7, and now the only computer move here to save the situation is king to e2, which stops the whole discover checks, winning loads of material. King to e2 is the only move. You take this one, pawn, bishop takes back, only move, rook h to d8. And white's got three passed pawns all connected to each other. You can figure things out from here. So back in this position, as we said before, we went through h3 now, right, to complete once for all the h3 variation. What about bishop to e2 straight away? This is a very boring one, but it's actually easy to play. Pawn takes in d4. We're going to isolate that pawn no matter what. So if the pawn takes, it becomes isolated. If the knight takes to preserve it, you now take in c3. There's an attack on the queen, so white has to take, and now that pawn is isolated. However, you now take the bishop, queen takes back, and now queen to d5, attacking the square, g2, and also protecting the knight. Castle, castle. a4 by white. Be able to develop the bishop from a more decent diagonal, you know, go and obviously create problems around our king. h5, we attack on the other side. Rook to d1. All these moves make sense, but you just ignore it. Bishop to c5, believe it or not. There are no strong discovered attacks by the knight, there's nothing. So bishop to b2, the idea of playing c4, very strong move. Knight to e5, that's it. Knight to b5 now, double attack. I mean, there's a discovered attack on the queen. What to do? Simply play queen to c4, ask for a trade. If that trade comes, you're completely winning because of the very ugly pawn structure of our opponent. If the queen refuses, let's say queen c2, just take, rook d8, favors all the swaps, and we're just confident to win this game. Let's look at this move here. You might ask, queen f5, check. Okay, obviously if you move the king, you lose the game. Knight to d7, and now queen can take this pawn. What's happening here? g6. The queen will have to move, and once she does, you're taking this weak pawn, and you're gonna win with the a passed pawn. Obviously, the rook can't go to a1 because you're gonna win the knight, and this knight will have to move. This knight cannot be defended by the pawn because this is a free pawn. It's not poisoned. And knight to d4, going back in the center, you play knight to e5, attacking the queen. The queen will have to move. Queen h3 check. Move the king, and you're safe. You're good to go. No problems at all. Knight c6 doesn't do anything because you can take it with the knight. Rook a1 now seems possible, but you just play queen c4. Your bishop is defending a7. You're completely safe. We're going to take it from there. So back in this position, after taking the knight, there was an attack on the queen, so we went through pawn takes. What if white takes this knight? This is an interesting variation. Now you take this one with the queen. Bishop takes back. Knight takes back, and we're up in material, obviously. So this knight will have to be saved, but if you play knight d4 to save it, check. And after blocks, you can take the bishop, king has to take back, and then knight f2 attacks the rook, then you've got a safe square to go to, and you're up a piece. If instead the king moves, then simply long castle. And in this position, by the way, instead of knight back to d4 at this point, what about f3, attacking the bishop, counter-attacking? Well, bishop to d7 attacks the knight, and you're going to win the knight. If the knight moves, it looks like our knight is now lost, and we're not losing in material, so we play c5. We're going to win in material anyway. If the knight goes back to e2, for example, you just castle long. And now, obviously, it's not advisable for white to capture that knight, because you're going to have a discovered check with a skewer. You see, it's a double check, and then they move, and then check, and then you're going to go for the rook. It's a very famous one. So here in this position, after c5, what if the knight doesn't go to e2, but rather b3? Does this stop everything? What, bishop to a4 comes now. And when this knight is finally recaptured, c4 recaptures once again the piece. So let's look at something else now. This is going to be from one of the main moves. So here, after knight c3 and knight f6, the white player can choose to take this knight, this pawn in d5 straight away. Okay, you take back, and after e4, we know we have to take this knight. Pawn takes back, and white has a great center. However, you're going to play e5. Now, after d5, we know we have to play knight b8. And we've seen this a lot. We've seen a lot of stuff. A move we have never seen before that I recently encountered in a game and I wanted to show is f4. So what to do now? We play bishop c5. And now, two options we're going to look at. One of them is... well, okay, pawn takes in e5 is not worth saying because queen h4 wins the game. There's nothing here. It's a disaster, as you know. The king will have to move, but going to e2 runs into checkmate very soon. Going to d2 seems like you don't really have a productive check, and the king might go to c2 and then b1. Here you take in e4, and obviously you're threatening bishop to e3 with horrible consequences. If the queen goes to, let's say, f3 to develop, and allow maybe bishop d3 and actually make it, you are still winning. Pawn takes in e5, and now bishop to d3 develop, just castle. Now this might look like one of those situations where the opponent king is actually safe, but it's not. I mean, yeah, I guess this game can continue. You're not going to checkmate. However, let's say knight to e2 developing, knight to d7. You're going to have to keep going, but it's position evaluated -3 out of the opening. So you're going to have to take it from here, but like you're completely winning, as you can tell. Your king is safe. The opponent king will never be. Even after rook e1, then you just play rook e8. This knight can't move. And yeah. So back in this position, after f4 and we play bishop c5, what if our opponent just develops the knight and finalizes the attack on e5, and now he really wants to take this pawn for free because the knight is in f3. Now we have to take. And after the bishop takes back, looks like some sort of king's gambit variation. However, castle, bishop d3 developing, rook e8. That's how you play this. Now let's make an example, a move like queen c2, just to clarify that that pawn in e4 is pain, there's no poison, there's nothing, there's no counterattack, you just take the pawn in d5 for free. If e5 comes, white seems to be doing really good. However, bishop c4, bishop g4, pain in the knight, queen to c2 moving away, attacking the square h7, knight to d7, just ignore it. We don't care, because after bishop takes and king h8, white can now long castle. Or maybe white could have brought the bishop back, but then we will win the pawn in e5, which is much more important. Either way, you can take, and now queen to h4 attacks this bishop and the other bishop as well. It's a fork. So that's an example of how of these variations. Whenever I encounter new lines, there will be more videos, extra videos. At the moment, let's leave it there. And now I just wanted to mention one more thing from this type of scenario. Instead of f4, when they play knight f3, we know we have to play bishop d6, and we want to play knight d7, knight c5. What if they play bishop e3 straight away? I've never gone through this. So now we castle, and after queen to c2 developing, knight to d7, bishop e2, also because knight to c5 was going to come then. So bishop e2 developing. Well, bishop to c5 comes and forces a swap with that bishop, because that bishop we're going to take and then isolate and double up the pawns. So after take, a move like knight e5 just is really bad, because you attack the knight with rook e8. When the knight moves, you take the pawn in e4. And the queen is attacking the pawn in d5, so white cannot castle. So what if white plays c4 to protect the pawn and then ready to castle and play a normal game? You play bishop f5 with the threat of knight g3, capturing the rook. So bishop d3 is not possible because you got discover checks. Queen to d1, and now you can simply play knight c3, killing the white player on the spot. So that's just an example. White shouldn't take the pawn in e5 with the knight. Now in this position here, instead of knight e5, what if white just castles and then maybe keeps putting pressure on that pawn? You play queen to d6. And you're going to carry on the game from here. Rook A to b1 is a move that I encountered myself, and I punished it immediately with f5. That's how you play this game, f5. You're winning this pawn for free. The bishop cannot block, because you can take the pawn, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, and then bishop f5 will do the job. If they take, then bishop f5 is just a plain skewer. So let's continue exploring the lines we haven't seen. And let's change topic for a second. Now here, we're playing Chigorin, and after knight f3 early on, we play bishop g4, as we know from many of the previous videos, and e3 is met with e5. Now, there's a variation we have never seen. So after bishop e2, we play e4, as we know. And now we've seen a little bit of everything, knight g1, knight d2, knight e5. After knight e5, we know we have to take the bishop, but crazy enough, we've never seen. And now here, when we saw this move, this variation in the past, we didn't go through queen takes back, but rather knight takes c6, with an attack on the queen. In this case, we're simply going to go through queen recapture. Now, what to do now? Okay, so this is just a better structure for black. So you take the knight, pawn takes back, and now queen to g5 is the key move, targeting this pawn and this pawn. So that's a fork. Now, you're winning material, so at this point, white might as well just take this pawn. And now the best move is actually castle long. We're not going to take this one, we're not going to take that one. We don't care yet. Let's make an example. If e6 comes now with an idea of smashing everything around our, let's say, taking on the pawn, maybe keep some material advantage. Just to make an example, e6 to disrupt the pawn. Obviously, we're not going to take this pawn. That would be silly. Queen takes in g2. Only move now is rook f1, saving the rook. And now you recapture this one. The difference is that now when you get taken back, our opponent will not be able to develop anything. So black is just better here. Now let's go on with some developing moves. For example, knight c3. Your rook's a very strong attack in this fight, but white will have to castle long side. So you take this pawn. That's a free pawn. And now after bishop d2 developing, knight f6. And after castling, it looks like a completely normal game here. But now you play queen e5, and you should also recapture this pawn. And if the queen protects that pawn, then you play rook e8. And you are going to take it. Position evaluated -2. So our opponent, since the very start of the game, just made a bad choice into pushing e6. So let's go back a few moves. So back in this position, we just play queen g5, and that's a fork. We're winning a pawn no matter what. That's a crucial pawn. Let's look at this. Knight to c3, developing. Okay, you recapture this pawn. That's the best thing to do. Two options we're going to look at. One of them is castle. Seems to be making sense. Knight f6. Finishing the attack on this pawn. We're going to take it. So let's say, for example, h3. Just make an example, right? You just play knight takes pawn, right? For free. If white plays rook to d1, protecting that pawn. Bishop to d6, threatening to reach h2. It's a very strong attack. g3 stops it, but now you play h5 with the idea of playing h4 and disrupt the pawn chain. This is already completely winning for black, as you notice. h4 by white, fine. g5, and that's it. If they take you, you take back. If they don't take you, you take them, and you're going to go to h2 no matter what. It's a fantastic position. It's a gift. So here it seems like castling might be a little bit dangerous after taking the pawn in e5. What about queen g4 check? It does give a check and also puts more attack on this pawn. You play f5 and now you saved everything. Queen g3, calming down the initiative. Bishop to d6. We don't care about being taken because this pawn in d5 is weak and we're going to take it later on. Take. Castle now seems possible. Knight f6, finalizing the pressure on that pawn. So if, for example, if white develops, let's say bishop d2, whatever, you just take this pawn and you go into a winning endgame, honestly. Rook to d1, to protect that pawn, you take the knight. Pawn takes back, and now we have removed the defender, and you can just take this one. So once again, that's a faulty variation. So let's take it from the start. So in the knight f3 variation, bishop g4, e3, e5. Let's look at this variation. Pawn takes in e5. Pawn takes back in c4. We have seen this in the past. After take, the bishop can now recapture this pawn in c4, and knight can take back. Now the knight cannot take the knight in e5 because rook d1 is mate. And in the past we went through, the bishop has to go back, and I mentioned that knight d3 check is the move. Now there's a lot of threats, so the bishop has to take the knight, rook takes back. And now that's what we need to go through. We haven't really analyzed this line deeply, and it's worth it. Knight to c3 now is necessary. You play f6. This is the key move to stop knight e5, winning the game for white. Castle, knight e7. And now knight to d4 is the most played move in this position. White can't really develop this bishop. Can't really develop b3 because then he will take this knight. So knight to d4 comes now. The idea of playing f3 and then e4. Being able to develop the bishop and so on. You play c5. And when the knight moves again, a6, attack the knight. And now the knight has to go back to a3. This check doesn't do anything because when you attack the knight with the king, then the knight will have nowhere safe to go. As you can see, all of these squares are taken multiple times. So after a6, the knight has to go to a3. And now b5, threatening a fork. Knight to c2. Saving the knight is the only way. Knight to d5. We're looking for a swap with double attack on this knight. So the knight will have to take. h3 attacking the bishop. What to do? Bishop f5. Knight e1. Since the knight was being attacked, rook to d7. You'll see why in a second. Knight to f3, reaching a good square. Bishop e4. Simple as that. What's the plan? Let's make an example. b3 to develop the bishop from the fianchetto. The only thing that makes sense. King f7. Bishop to b2. Bishop e7. That's how you complete development. Rook f to d1. And we're happy to swap. Even though our opponent has the open file. But now you understand why we're winning. It's these three pawns against these two. They're already very advanced. There's nothing to do already. We have the bishop pair as well. Knight d2 attacking the bishop. Rook to d8 is the best move. We're going to close the line there. You're going to have to figure it out from here. So one more variation now that needs to be seen. This is from the very previous video. I forgot to show it, even though I had it in my notes. Queen a4 now. The early queen a4. As we know, we take the knight. And after g takes back, you take this one. We went through e4 in the previous video, but I forgot to go through e3. Okay, fine, you play e5, and now got triple attack on the pawn in d4. Something has to be done. d5 gets taken, so pawn takes, and now queen d5, threatening here, threatening here, threatening here. Well, the knight is pinned, so no. Anyway, bishop c4 with an attack on the queen. What to do? Queen f3 attacking the rook. Rook has to move, rook g1. Queen h5, attacking this pawn once again. f4 is super weakening. That cannot be played because after you're attacking this pawn, you make a check. You can do anything you want. This is a huge weakness. f4 is really stupid. e6 by white, disrupting the pawn chain, castle long. And when the pawn takes in f7, you completely ignore it. You play queen takes h2. Now obviously taking this knight here doesn't do anything because you're going to check here, and then this is going to a checkmate very soon. So after rook f1, now you develop the knight. And after knight c3, it looks like it might be a normal game. Our opponent just needs to play bishop d2 and castle long. And besides, he also has this very annoying pass pawn. However, knight to d7 comes now with the threat of knight b3, winning the bishop pair. And most importantly, controlling the file properly when the queen is out of that diagonal. Okay, bishop b5. What to do now? Well, knight d2 e5, change of plans. And now we're threatening this move, depending on what our opponent will do as well. Game is completely winning. And crazy enough, if white does take the knight, you just take back with the pawn. And now nothing stops you from going to d3. So if queen a7 looks very scary, but simply knight d3, check. And when the king moves to e2, queen h5, and then you can take it from there. If instead the king goes to, let's say, d1, then queen g2 attacks the rook and wins the rook, basically. Our opponent doesn't have any checks. After this move, you move here. There are no follow-ups. There's an attack on the queen as well. So there's nothing to do. And back in this position, instead of bishop takes, what about f4? Just to make an example. That's this weakness. This is such a weakness that you can even afford to give up the knight for free. You just play bishop e7, finishing development, preparing bishop h4, winning the game. So let's look at the last couple of lines and we will close this video. So in the main line, when they take in d5, you take back. After knight f3 to defend the pawn, you play e5, knight c3, pin the knight. And now after e3, we know we have to take this one. And after knight takes. In the past, we went through queen takes, but we've never seen pawn takes. So let's quickly see what's going on here. This is just bad because either white had taken with the queen or not, the pawn is isolated anyway. Because if white takes with the queen, we take the queen and isolate the pawn. Bishop d7, a3 attacking the bishop. Crazy enough, we reunite the pawn structure of the opponent. So what's going on here? Are we contradicting ourselves? Castle long. This is just better development. Two options we're going to look at. One of them is bishop e3, developing. For example, you play knight h6, c4, attacking the queen, queen c6. d5 once again. Okay, queen g6. And now it looks like this pawn is free to be taken. We can't really take back because it gets really dangerous. Let's make an example. We can play b6 now here, right? But white can play a4 with the idea of a5. However, it's too late now. Rook h2 e8, check. Bishop e2. And now queen goes to g2, attacking the rook. So the rook moves, but now rook to e2. Boom! It's an incredible move. Obviously, if king takes, then bishop f5 skewers the king and queen. So if queen takes, then rook e8 pins the queen to the king. So that was just a variation and see some sample moves on what the plans are according to what your opponent does. So in this position, instead of bishop e3 that we saw before, what about c4 straight away? Queen c6 once again, d5, queen f6. The difference now is that we're putting an attack on the rook instead of g6. Bishop e3 defends, and now the rook is defended, but it's too late. Queen c3 check. And now, can't block with the queen because the rook loses. And bishop d2 now blocks rook e8 check. Bishop blocks. Rook e2 once again. Hehe. If queen takes, then the queen is taking this rook, so winning material. If king takes, check with the queen. The king has to move. Obviously, go in here. You play bishop and you win the queen. King back to e1. Knight f6 very quietly. We're going to play rook e8, conquering glory. And you might argue that this doesn't seem to work. For example, rook c1, but you're just taking d5. Opponent king has lost the right to castle. It's a completely winning position for black, as you can tell. Last line, and then we'll finally close this saga. is the, well, from the main line, pawn takes in d5, queen takes back. We're not going to look at knight f3, but rather e3 straight away. Here we still respond with e5, and after knight c3, bishop b4. Now this can be met in two ways. If bishop d2 comes now, obviously you have to take the knight. If bishop takes, you have this attack over here, you can swap everything. The opponent also loses the bishop pair, but gets an isolated pawn. So after pawn takes back, knight f6, c4 attacking the queen, queen d6, d5 attacking the knight, knight e7, it's all good. Two options now. If knight f3, castle. And now bishop e2 developing, c6. We're going to take that pawn no matter what. If they take, we take back with the knight. If a3 now with the idea of bishop b4, very strong move, you play e4, we don't care. Because now we're attacking a piece, and if bishop does go there, you can attack that piece as well. So the knight will have to move. Knight d4, and now we take this pawn. Bishop e4 appears to be possible now. Queen e5, we don't care. Castle, and now you're taking c4 as well. It's a bit counterintuitive, because now the bishop takes back, we're helping the development. However, knight g4, preparing the capitalization. Queen h2 here is game over, so g3 has to be played. Rook to d8 comes now, pinning the knight. h3 to attack the knight. Wait, knight a3. Hehe. And now there's a fork to queen and a rook, so the pawn takes. But now check, king moves, check, king moves, check, and you're gonna have to take it from here. You got double attack on this knight. It's completely over, as you can tell. So in this position, by the way, earlier we went through knight f3. What happens after this move? This is a move I encountered recently, f3, with the idea of playing e4, because e4 was under attack, and that's a very strong center for white. Now here you play e4 before white gets a chance to do that. Be careful. So queen c2 now, continuing the attack on that pawn, ignore it, castle. And after take, you go with the queen to e5, and I get ready to recapture with the knight. And also, there's an attack on the rook, so this bishop cannot go to d3 to defend the pawn. So rook to d1, and now you can take this pawn. So after take, bishop d3, looks like completely fine position for white, but actually bishop f5 now, and white realized that this was an overextension. Knight f3 developing, bishop g6, to avoid the annoying knight h4, which can still happen. But first, let's give some safety to white. Castle, knight g3 comes now with an attack on this bishop. And also there's an attack on this rook. So if this takes, then you take this. The rook moves. Now you take this. You're completely winning. And in this position, you might argue, what about knight to h4 instead of castling? Well, that's actually the better chance for white. Here now you're going to play rook f to e8. And when the knight takes the bishop, you take back with the knight, so the knight is protected. And you're gonna remove the bishop f from the opponent and capitalize on this weak pawn in e3, right? If you take here, but also white can play bishop b4 to stop the trade. You play a5, and so that the trade was inevitable. If bishop to a3 seems possible, but now knight c3, attack on the rook, attack on this pawn, attack on this pawn. The rook will have to save itself. Best move according to the engine is rook d2 to save the pawn, and now knight to b1 is the key move, and it's attacking this bishop and it's attacking the rook. The only thing left to do is to take the bishop, but then check, and you're recapturing this one, and then you can take the game from there. It's a better endgame for black, as you can clearly see. The very last line is the following. So take, and it's also the most annoying one. It's the one that has given me the most problems since when I started playing the Chigorin, because I never studied it properly. So I decided to analyze it carefully. It's a line that is actually not good, but let's see. Knight c3, bishop b4, and now pawn takes e5. This is a stupid move, as you can clearly see, but the problem is that it kind of makes the game boring. So what to do? Well, take the queen, king takes back, and now take this pawn, and basically the opponent lost the right to castle, although it's not that big a deal. So let's see a couple of plans here. If white develops the knight, for example, you take it. Pawn takes back, you play bishop e6. The idea of long castle. Rook to g1, for instance, attacking this pawn, it's a thematic move. You castle long, there's an attack on the king, so obviously king to c2 is a usual move in this position. Also puts more protection over the knight in case our opponent doesn't want to break the pawn structure. Here you have to play g6. to stop the infiltration of the rook. a3 attacking the knight, bishop d6. And now you can see that our development is just making our life better. There's no way to save this pawn without making backwards moves. f4 seems to be making sense here, stops the infiltration. Now knight f6. And this knight is about to become really strong. So let's see, development, bishop d2. Also, you cannot play h3 to stop knight g4 because you can take it. So after bishop d2, actually this is now quite better for white, for black, because you can check from f5. And this rook is not getting developed for a while. Although it's quite an open game, everything can happen. You're gonna have, there's no way that I could go through more lines from now. So instead of that, instead of bishop d2, in this position, it's quite usual that they play f3 to stop any jump of the knight. And also now bishop f5 is pointless because they can play e4 and you're in big trouble. Rook h2 e8 is the best move now. Now the plan of the black player is simple. You want to play bishop to f8 so that you can play knight d5. The knight is being defended by the rook, so in case of swap you can take back. Let's say you play bishop here, then you want to play this, and if the knight doesn't take you, then you can just play bishop here and finalize the pressure on e3. So that's the plan you're going for. So after bishop to f8, what if white tries to develop? Bishop to d2. Here the best thing to do is to activate the pieces. Check, king takes, and rook takes bishop. Position evaluated minus 150. There will be some extra dedicated to this line in the future, most likely. Because this is just a bad variation. So if your opponent plays it, you just have the advantage. But at the moment I can say that after so many videos, we can all play the Chigorin very well and achieve great results. We know so much about it, and see you next time.